And it's across the board. If you look at the top 350 corporations in the United States today, and you go back to 1965, the CEO, the chief executive officer of those major corporations, were paid on average about 20 times more than the average worker pay. And that includes wages and benefits, 20 to 1 back in 1965. Today, it's 344. And the average CEO compensation for these major corporations is now about $25 to $30 million a year.
Hello, and welcome to How We Change the World podcast. I'm Deborah Rowan. In today's episode, we're diving into the topic of populism with Steve Babson, who's a retired labor instructor and author. Steve's latest book offers this insightful look into a really pivotal moment in American history when a third political party first emerged and the term populism was actually born. Now, in this conversation, we explore how the early populist movement began and how it helped advance things like the women's right to vote, interracial cooperation, especially in the South, and the direct election of senators, among other milestones. Steve also sheds light on the contemporary use of the word populism, which is a term now used pejoratively to describe this very wide range of political figures, with everyone from Donald Trump to Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden. So join us for a journey through the past that actually offers some vital insights into our present political climate. Ready? Let's begin. Hello, Steve Babson, and welcome to How We Change the World podcast.
Hi, how are you? I'm glad to be here.
Good. I'm really glad to have you here. It's lovely to meet you and learn from you on the topic of populism, which is really the subject of this conversation today, and its origins in this country and its impact on relevance on our current political climate. Especially, I guess, as we move toward the 2024 election, that term just keeps rising up in the news and in pundits, and everyone's using it.
Right.
So I think we should start, and it is confusing. That's why I appreciated you writing about this and talking about this, because I think it can be very confusing what's really going on with that term and what it really means in today's world. So we will get into all that. So. And I think it's good to do this before the election year starts, so the more people understand terms and motivations, the better prepared we'll be. But let's start. I'd like to start by introducing you specifically. And you have devoted your career to being, and I want to ask you about this, being a labor educator and a union activist. So first of all, what is a labor educator? What do you mean by that?
Well, I worked at Wayne State University in the Labor Studies Center, and my actual task was not so much undergraduates, although I did have some undergraduate teaching, but largely it was adult education, and it was off campus. So we were part of an extension program that supported the labor movement and workers, whether they were in a union or not, in the same way that many universities have an extension program for agriculture that would help farmers and farm organizations. We were the same thing in an urban setting in Detroit. So a lot of my teaching was off campus. Some of it was in local union halls. Sometimes it was in the factory. Sometimes it was in a bowling alley or a convention center.
Interesting. And what were you teaching them specifically about?
Well, a whole range of things. It was sort of, a one-room schoolhouse. I would be teaching sometimes labor history. Sometimes I was teaching economics. Sometimes I was thinking about collective bargaining and issues related to organizing and conducting union affairs, stewards training, a whole range of issues, whether it was labor law, labor history, collective bargaining, or what have you.
And being in Detroit, that is definitely a topic of conversation that's probably continually going on.
Sure, absolutely. Although it's a labor movement in real crisis these days, especially facing the ongoing issue of the export of production to Mexico, to China, and places further afield. Although there's some very good news recently. I think the UAW, United Auto Workers, which is the dominant union here, has gone through a revitalization, a democratic movement that recovered, I think, the initiative and gives a lot of auto workers hope that they can actually recover a lot of the ground they've lost in recent years as the companies have moved production elsewhere and demanded concessions, and workers have fallen behind dramatically as these companies have proven to be extraordinarily profitable. So the recent UAW strikes are never fun, but sometimes they're necessary to get the attention of the people who wield the actual power. And I think it was a very positive outcome for working people.
Hugely. I mean, even those of us who don't follow that closely couldn't help but hear about the successes that were just, I think they're interpreted as successes. I don't know if everyone got everything they wanted on the labor side.
Well,
but
you never get everything you wanted,
yeah.
but I think it clearly has rebounded in a very positive way because a lot of the non-union companies felt compelled to raise wages because obviously with UAW members doing so well with substantial increases that the companies could afford. I mean, they were making billions and billions of dollars in profit as they recovered from the crisis of 10 years ago. But workers were not catching back up with where they had been. And so that's what this strike was about. And as a result, Tesla and Toyota and Nissan have all had to raise their wages because otherwise those workers who are not yet UAW members might feel all the more compelled to think about joining the union. And that's what the union is now proposing to them, that they can see the positive gain that was made. And so why not join the movement?
And global implications, because I just heard it on the radio this morning about Tesla, I think in Northern Europe, I think it was in Denmark, was it, or Norway? I should know
Sweden,
that, but
Sweden.
Well, Sweden, I can't believe I missed it. But
Right.
yeah, but I think it was actually more that they were moving on to those other countries. There's one of those two countries that was also starting with something with Tesla, being inspired by their neighbors.
Well,
So
I'll tell you one place Tesla is moving, and that's Mexico. Elon Musk has announced a major investment, substantial multi-billion-dollar investment in a major assembly plant near Monterrey, Mexico. And of course, we'll be able to build Teslas there, paying workers 1/10 of what they would be paid here for doing the exact same work.
It's upsetting that and we'll get into this in just a moment, but what you write about and the historical precedents for all this, history just keeps repeating itself again and again and again, and that's certainly been the case in this as well.
By the way, I would not argue it repeats itself, but I do like the phrase that it often rhymes.
Oh yeah, I did hear that a long time ago and haven't in a long time. Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. All right. Well, you also have your PhD in history, so I'm sure you could talk to us about a number of different issues and educate us. But today we're actually here to talk about, at least part of the time, this book that you wrote, Forgotten Populists, When Farmers Turn Left to Save Democracy. And I think it's a wonderful book. It's got pictures in it. It's got historical pictures in it, and it's short, but it is really interesting for anybody who's trying to grapple with what populism meant initially and what it means today. And I'm going to have you sort of titrate or separate those out for us so that we can understand. Because today when people think populism, they tend to think authoritarianism. They tend to think Donald Trump or some of the European leaders that have come into power. And that's not the case. So maybe could you start by talking about the differences in what populism meant in this era that you're going to talk to us about in the late 1800s versus what it means today and how I always think when I hear populism.
Yeah, it's funny because today, populism is a term applied to a whole range of politicians who, in my estimate, have very little in common. I mean, and when I first became focused on this matter was when Trump ran for president in 2016, was described as a populist. And in the Democratic Party, in the primaries, Bernie Sanders was running, obviously a democratic socialist and not sharing any politics with Trump, and yet both were described as populists.
Right.
Thought, how can this possibly be a sustainable way of thinking about our past? And it gets even stranger because right now you find quite a few in the media, particularly Forbes and places like that, The Economist, more conservative and business-oriented media, they're calling Biden a populist. So here we have Biden, Trump, and Bernie Sanders representing different points along the political spectrum, from right to left, all described as populists. And to me, what I think often is meant by it is that it's equated with anti-elitism.
Mm-hmm.
Although what elite you're talking about is left to the imagination, and obviously Bernie Sanders is talking about a very different elite from what Donald Trump is talking about, and what Richard Nixon talked about. Remember, Richard Nixon invoked the silent majority against the media elite or the liberal elite.
Right.
It's sort of a common phrasing in American politics, and I don't think it really means much these days. The term has been actually rendered, I think, meaningless by its use across such a broad spectrum of politicians, and it doesn't really tell us much. I guess maybe the best way to think of it is that it's a way of talking in which you direct attention to elites that are allegedly corrupt. And Donald Trump does that, and Bernie Sanders does that, and sometimes Joe Biden does that. And it's your choice whether you find the particular elite that's been targeted worthy of that attention.
Well, I wonder if it's because the term populism has been, or calling someone a populist has been successful. It was successful it wasn't successful for Bernie, but it was successful to describe Trump that way. But if if those three people are all described as populists, you're right. It literally has no meaning left.
Right.
And
It sort of gives the appearance of insight without really actually representing anything substantial.
And that's the problem. Nobody understands it. Everyone's using it to describe people and perhaps to misuse it to draw voters in one direction or the other, which is something that we will see in this election that we're all dreading probably coming up.
Right. And I think it's used to invoke a fear. And Trump does not describe himself as a populist. Bernie Sanders doesn't describe himself as a populist.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Neither does obviously Joe Biden.
Right.
And so it's a term that's often used as a kind of sly pejorative to sort of suggest, well, maybe they're not quite trustworthy. And usually it's the elites that feel they're being targeted who are saying, these people are populists, watch out. And so that's somehow supposed to mean demagogic and authoritarian. And sometimes it means that. I think in the case of Donald Trump, it does. I don't think it means that for either Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders.
I wonder if it also isn't used to describe who people, who the culprits are, right? So for some people, the culprits are the financial elite, the billionaires, the chief executives,
Right.
that are increasing this divide between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. But for Trump, he kind of used it more as a way to be against immigrants, to be against those who are coming up against, and women and anyone who gets in the way of the traditional white male
Elite.
elite. Yeah. So, and then you hear a lot about talking about snowflakes, you're talking about proper language, the specific language that Democrats want to use. A lot of people think that's elitist, that everybody has to speak the right way and not offend anybody. So it's all over the board. So I guess we've established that, but, let's see. Well, why don't we jump into then having you describe maybe brief or as long as you want, actually, overview of how this started, because it is, and I don't know if it started in the United States specifically, but in the late 1800s, the populist movement began, and I don't know if
it began in the 1890s.
Okay.
And it had forerunners in the 1880s, the Farmers Alliance and the Knights of Labor, but the Populists, actually it was called the People's Party, but as a sort of shorthand, they called themselves Populists.
So is that where the phrase was coined? Was in the United States in the 1890s?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And unfortunately, it's been exported as if it was somehow relevant to Europe, and it's not. The people in Europe who are called populists, none of them call themselves populists. It's, again, a kind of a sly pejorative to suggest they're maybe authoritarian, not trustworthy, and so on. But in the 1890s, the original populists were actually about contesting and challenging the way in which both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party of that time were both clearly favoring the new class of rich investors who had come to power after the
Mm.
Civil War. After 1865, the Civil War ends, and in the
Mm-hmm.
following decades, that's when you see the arrival of these, what were often called robber barons, the Rockefellers and the Andrew Carnegies and the Cornelius Vanderbilt, the mega rich of that era.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them involved in railroad construction, which was the dominant driving force in industrialization in the United States, and initially welcomed. A
Mm-hmm.
little bit like the internet, initially welcomed, but then increasingly seen as not operating in the anticipated way that would benefit all of us. And so railroads, likewise, initially were seen as a welcome arrival, a way of linking markets and producers across the continent. And so lots of subsidies
Mm-hmm.
voted for and favored initially. But over time, what became clear was that these railroads were being operated in a context where there was no regulation, no standards stipulated for how they should be behaving and what they should be doing with these public resources, by the way, which were substantial. To encourage the building of the transcontinental railroads and the major rail lines, the federal and state governments that were both behind this initial investment gifted those corporations 170 million acres of free land from across the United States. And that's equivalent to the size of Texas.
It's amazing.
It was simply gifted to them, along
Mm.
with cash for building each mile of railroad, along with tax exemptions, along with a whole range of gifts from public resources, including looking the other way when there was massive fraud being conducted. So, for example, a railroad, the owners would receive these public subsidies from taxpayer revenue, and they would then secretly buy up the company that they were contracting with to actually lay the rails. And then they would have that contractor, which they owned, double charge the railroad, paid for with taxpayer money. Massive fraud. And this was going on. It was well known what was happening here. And so
who were the main owners before you continue of was it Carnegie? Was that who?
Carnegie was a steal.
Uh-huh.
Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould was another infamous one of the bandits who were just basically operating on a sort of, well, there's no regulation. I'm going to do whatever I care to because
Sure.
God wants me to become wealthy. This was the argument that Rockefeller made. He said, God
Oh, really?
Yes. And the way he became wealthy for Standard Oil was by secretly colluding with the railroads that were transporting the oil that he was pumping out of the ground. So he got a special deal from them. And any of his competitors would actually be penalized and have to pay higher rates. And this was a secret collusion carried out by these monopoly corporations. And this kind of behavior was becoming increasingly evident to a larger number of people. And the populists were the ones who said, we got to stop this. This should not be the way we're going. What we need is a government fortified by democratic reform that can take on big business and have sufficient public backing to enforce regulation, to force them to actually behave in a way that suits the needs of the broadest number of people, farmers and workers. And the argument was that, well, if the railroads won't comply, it was public money that built them in the first place, then maybe the railroad should be run by the public for the public benefit. And that
scared
was
everybody. Yeah. I mean, that type of, like, I guess, call it nationalizing the main things that then all of a sudden they're maybe interpreted as communists or socialists or something, correct?
You know what they called themselves? Among the populists, some would later become socialists, but at the time in the 1890s, they generally described themselves as simply reformers, and they wanted more regulation and so on. They wanted to expand the money supply to bring down interest rates. But many of them called themselves Christian socialists, and they believed that Jesus was a commoner and an agrarian radical, and that Jesus advocated for improving our world as we live in it now, and that's what Christianity should be about, would be a force on behalf of positive, forward-looking reforms that would help Christians and Jews and whoever living in this now rapidly industrializing society. A society in some ways similar to what we know today, particularly in terms of the gross differences in income, but also quite different. At that time, in the 1890s, And the reason the subtitle of the book is When Farmers Turned Left is that at that time, about 45% of the working population were farmers or farm workers.
Yeah, that's an amazing change.
Right. And today it's like 2%.
If that, right? Yeah.
So that we have some of the same issues, but there's also, this is what I meant earlier when I said history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it does rhyme because what we're seeing is the same extraordinary inequality in power and income and economic opportunity between the mega rich of today and the robber barons back in the 1890s.
So just to insert something here, that sounds like Bernie Sanders talking, right? I mean, not you, but just saying that that's really the issue. He's the one who's been on that bent for a very long time, that the split's getting wider and wider and wider. So he seems to be I'm just following along. It does feel like if you talk about people today, he seems to be the most in line with populists of the 1890s.
I would agree. And, and I tend to be in that, full disclosure, that's sort of where my politics are coming from. I see Bernie Sanders as someone. There's others, and it doesn't have to be the people who are identified with his politics alone. But I believe we need to actually be acting on behalf of public benefit for public resources that have been gifted to corporations. And we need to actually insist on corporations behaving in ways that suit the largest number of us. And by the way, in the 1890s, I forgot one thing. What the railroads were getting away with was an extraordinary mismanagement of the rail system. They were almost always in bankruptcy.
Oh.
And in fact, the operation of the railroads was extraordinarily dangerous. In 1891, 2,600 railroad workers were killed on the job, 25,000 injured. And this is because the railroads were shorting on training, on investment, on upkeep of the equipment, cutting corners wherever it suited them. And the result was often massive accidents.
So there are multiple reasons for getting the railroads under some type of control, or some type of regulation at the very least, both financially and from a safety perspective.
Right. And by the way, that's an issue today as well, as we've seen with these massive railway accidents that are preventable and come from the same sort of cost cutting and shorting of safety issues.
It's funny because that was the next thing I wanted to ask you is how does that compare to the economics of today and to the conditions that we're seeing today? There's probably a lot of parallels if you really start looking at the two eras side by side.
Oh, I agree. And one of them that might be of particular interest to folks would be the differences in top and bottom income. And I'll talk about, I won't burden folks with too much in the way of statistics, but these are numbers that really strike home. In 1892, the year Jay Gould died, he was making, roughly speaking, and the estimates vary, but about $25,000 a day, at a time when workers were paid between 50 cents a day and $4 a day. And by the way, $25,000 a day back then, today would be about $850,000 a day, daily income.
He was making this much, and he was one of the main owners.
He was one of the he was owned about 12 different railroads.
Okay,
and was infamous for his misbehavior, not only, by the way, towards workers and customers, but often enough towards investors. This is a guy who, when he was CEO of the Union Pacific Railroad, shorted his own company's stock. And that's an obscure business, but it means he bet against his own company secretly. Yeah. Today that would be illegal, and he would probably go to jail. Yeah. But that was common practice back in the day. So here we are. We now fast forward to today, and we look at our own new class of robber barons. And they include, I'll take three of them in particular. And this doesn't, by the way, I'm not commenting on their, personal worth, but I'm talking about the extraordinary inequality of income. So Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos. So we've got Microsoft, Amazon, and Berkshire Investments. Those three men have the wealth equivalent to 160 million Americans.
That's just those three people do.
Just those three. So that's a massive, obviously, inequality. And it's across the board. If you look at the top 350 corporations in the United States today, and you go back to 1965, the CEO, the chief executive officer of those major corporations, were paid on average about 20 times more than the average worker pay. And that includes wages and benefits, 20 to 1 back in 1965. Today, it's 344.
Oh my goodness. Really?
And the average CEO compensation for these major corporations is now about $25 to $30 million a year.
What type of arguments do you hear when you're involved in any type of labor relations or, discussions or just in your general knowledge? What arguments are presented as to justification for that kind of? 1965, those kind of numbers kind of made sense. You have to have a lot of incentive to drive someone to take the risks and do all the things that a CEO needs to do, or an owner of, there are some arguments for why they should have such disparity between the high and low, but not to the numbers that you're talking today. What justification can there possibly be?
Well, they would try to argue that they have added so substantially to the value of the company that they should be rewarded in some comparable manner. I find that a weak argument, but it's the one that they often enough have made. Unfortunately for that argument, and those who would make that kind of advocacy, you can find all kinds of examples of poorly run companies that over time lost market share, deteriorated in value, and yet the CEO and the top investors who maybe got out early made out like bandits. And some of the behavior is so predatory. I don't see how it's defended. And I'm thinking of these private equity companies. The worst among them will buy up a company, and they'll operate on the reverse principle. Instead of the sum is greater than the parts are more valuable than the sum of it. So they'll sell off parts of the company.
Yeah.
And maximize the revenue from that sale. They gut the company, they hollow it out, and then they walk away from a company where now it's characterized by layoffs and underfunded pensions and benefits that are no longer deliverable. And that's the worst. Not all private equity companies do that. Of
course not. No.
But enough of them do to make anybody whose employer is perhaps looking is targeted by one of these companies. You should be saving your money because you're probably heading towards some kind of personal disaster in terms of economics.
Yeah. Well, it's a distressing conversation because it's hard to see it getting worse and worse and worse with very little pushback against it that is effective. A lot of verbal pushback, but.
Well, and by the way, I would point out that maybe we need to take a longer term perspective because the populists had a wide range of proposals for how to regulate, how to expand the money supply, how to bring down interest rates, how to get rid of the gold standard and implement a more equitable kind of financial system that would bring down, make credit affordable, a whole range of proposals. And most of them they were not able to implement. They had some success in the 1890s. They elected about 50 members of Congress. They elected 6 governors across the country. Hundreds and hundreds of mayors and local officials who joined the populist proposals for regulating the economy and changing the way it went. But they did not actually succeed overall. What did happen, though, is that the Democrats in particular basically co-opted part of the populist program in 1896 and in the years that followed. And in a way, the New Deal was almost the fulfillment in the 1930s. Of the reform agenda of populism. It took a long while, but they were in favor of things that we take for granted today, like votes for women, which the Constitution denied to women. And the populists were the first major party to actually propose that women should have the right to vote. They were also the party in the South that fought for voting rights for African Americans. They wanted a unified white and black farm movement. Now, they didn't go far enough. They didn't challenge the social segregation of the day, but they
Especially in the South,
definitely,
right? Yeah.
yeah. But nevertheless, compared to what was the prevailing racism
Right.
of that day, they were the ones taking these first steps. And they paid a huge price for it in the South, where many of them were simply targeted for assassination, for
Oh,
voter fraud.
really?
Yeah, I mean, it was a violent suppression of the
Hmm.
populace in the South that laid the basis for what later became the Jim Crow system.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but again, these were positive steps. We take for granted the election of senators, but back in the 1890s, senators were appointed by state legislatures that were often basically putting the position up for sale, and the
Mm.
highest bidder would become the nominee to sit in the U.S. Senate. The populists wanted election of senators.
And
They wanted secret ballots.
how long did it take for that to transpire? Like, when did we start getting when did we start getting the opportunity to vote for senators? What year was that?
Pretty much the same time as as women got the right to
Vote?
vote.
So
The 19 teens.
1920. Yeah.
Yeah, 19 teens.
Yeah. So you can't, one clearly led to the other. The actions of the populists clearly led to those eventualities of electing senators, of women getting the vote, at least played a major role, you
It
would
played a
say,
major
right?
role,
Yeah.
and it was clear at the time because it was William Jennings Bryan who became the Democratic Party candidate for president in 1896. He was not a populist, but he could see the writing on the wall. He could see that the populists were gaining ground and starting to win actually statewide elections
Hmm.
for Senate,
Hmm.
for the House, and therefore
Oh,
populist
oh,
senators,
okay.
and for
Yeah.
governors and so on. And so Bryan adopts part of the populist program, particularly around monetary reform. And in subsequent years, Democratic Party candidates for president, and leading up to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, adopt pretty much the entire populist program.
Yeah.
So it takes a while, but the people who took those first steps, those first risky steps in that direction, didn't have immediate they weren't immediately successful, but it started to change the whole political terrain in the United
Change
States.
the conversation. And also the conditions change, so sometimes an idea has to wait for the right time to come to
Right,
fruition.
right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, but you also say that I mean, at the time there were three parties, and really you had the Dems, the Republicans, and the Populists, and then the Democrats took over, absorbed or whatever, adopted part of the populist ideology. So then, what happened to the Populists and the
Well,
People's
actually,
Party?
in 1896, when Bryan won the Democratic nomination and adopted part of the populist program, the populists in that year had an internal debate. Should we endorse Bryan because he's at least given us half a loaf, not the full loaf, but a half a loaf?
Yeah,
Or should we hold out for what we believe is the necessary complete reform package? And that was a bitter debate. And in
good.
1896, the fusionists, as they called themselves, won that debate. And so the Populist Party endorsed William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat. And this was a problem for the populists in the years going forward because it really demoralized the more committed activists within that movement. In the South, it was a real disaster because the Democratic Party in the South was the party of white supremacy, was the party of Jim Crow. And the populists asked people to take that risk. Come on out, and we've got to challenge that.
Mm-hmm.
And they fought 1892, 1894 on behalf of a multiracial movement of white and black farmers. And then in 1896, they turned around and endorsed the same Democratic Party that was very often sponsoring the gunmen who were shooting down any advocates. So it really demoralized and defeated the party in the South, and they sort of disappeared. They moved into the Democratic Party, many of them. Many of them, by the way, moved into the Republican Party. And the Republican Party had a substantial historical wing for some decades. Kind of hard to believe now. They called themselves progressive Republicans.
If you look at the platform of the Republicans in the 1950s, it almost reads like a Democratic platform today. So they have, I mean, that's a funny term, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, of course, there probably were progressives in the Republican Party. And
There were.
It's a turning, so it might be an accurate term for the time. And progressive is like populist. You can use it any way you want.
Right. But the point is that the populists changed both parties.
I see your point. Yeah.
And both parties inched away from the past complete endorsement of anything the corporations wanted. And the populists, by the way, had to run as a third party because at that time in the 1890s, there was no primary system.
Yeah.
And so the party, the folks who controlled the parties could control the conventions, and it would become basically a cakewalk for whoever they favored. And an alternative voice within those parties was very difficult to articulate. So it's a tough political balance between these contending approaches. But I would argue today that a third party is probably not a good idea. It's very hard in the United States to do what's commonplace in Europe, whereas a parliamentary system where parties can win a minority of the vote, but they can then join a coalition of other parties and select a prime minister. Here,
many places of the world, right? In fact, most, it seems like, yeah.
Right. So here I would argue that the debate, at least for the time being, can be conducted within the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, it's very hard to imagine any kind of substantial debate these days.
Do you anticipate a third party? Well, I guess we do have RFK, but like a third party populist, the original meaning of populist candidate running? Do you think there'll be someone who fits that bill? Kind of looks like it does not, right? Yeah.
Yeah. This time around, it's really too late. To get on the ballot is no easy task.
Yeah.
And you have to develop a program over the preceding years to make sure you have the local base sufficient to actually mount a real challenge, not just a media-driven thing where you've got a lot of money and you back one Ross Perot, for example.
Right.
That was not a political party. That was a very wealthy man who had the money to put his name out there. But it takes more than that. And that's what the populists had a real base. They had over 2 million members in the Farmers Alliance and in the Knights of Labor.
When population was a lot smaller than it is now.
They had active chapters all across, principally the South and the Great Plains. That's where they were strongest.
So it's a multi-year, multi-decade even movement that has to begin if it were to begin. I mean, I heard you talk about some of the negative. Well, we didn't actually go back and finish what happened with the railroads, and that kind of leads to my next question. So let's do, because what I want to ask you about, just to give you some foresight, is the impact of not having any of that or enough of that. I don't know. We'll call it progressive rather than populist, because I think we throw people off of not having that. And like I heard you talk about how it can affect our ability to deal with climate change if we don't have enough of that voice, a progressive voice. I'm not going to use the word populist because I'm just going to confuse people. No. Progressive voice in today's politics. So going there in a moment, if we go back and look at what happened, what successes the populists had with the railroad, can you talk about that, or lack of success?
Well, eventually the railroads had to submit to massive regulation. And by the way, they were even nationalized for a brief moment during World War I because the for-profit system was so inept and incapable of coordinating a national transportation grid on behalf of the war effort in the case of World War I that they had to be taken over by the federal government. They were then given back afterwards, after the government had improved the engineering and upgraded a lot of the equipment.
Really?
It was gifted back to the railroad companies. By the way, they were nationalized again, remember, in the 1970s when the freight system collapsed and it had to be taken over by Conrail, which was, again, a public intervention to introduce some kind of rational planning for a continental-wide transportation grid, which often enough, for-profit corporations maximizing the short-term immediate interests are not capable of doing.
Right.
And I would argue we may be there again if we have these kinds of accidents that we've seen in recent years with these massive trains that are understaffed and causing, bedlam and real heartache and economic loss and killing people. I would argue, again, these are public resources built with public monies. and public intervention and public investment, they should be run for the public benefit.
Well, I think I agree with you. And I think on the East Coast, you have a lot of great train service, but really anywhere west of where you are,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm in Colorado. It's a joke. I'd love to take a train somewhere, and there's no high-speed trains. There's no affordable trains. I mean, there's no reason to go on a train unless you are literally trying to kill time and just want to go back to yesteryear and enjoy I mean, there's really no other benefit to taking a train today. It's hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, it requires years of investment is what it comes down to. And I live in Detroit, and my family is in Chicago, and so a lot of times my wife and I will be traveling to Chicago. Sometimes we drive, but often I prefer taking the railway, and it's really improved over the years. They've actually upgraded the rail system, and now actually high speed between Kalamazoo and Niles. It gets up to about 110 miles an hour. It becomes more and more affordable and sensible, but it takes money. It takes investment. It takes a commitment to that kind of public service. And that's what we often enough have been lacking. And you mentioned the thing about climate change.
Yeah,
I had earlier said we have to have a long-term perspective. I sort of believe that, but I also worry that we don't have a long-term here to fix the issues of climate change. It has to be almost an immediate effort to eliminate fossil fuels. And that's not going to be easy. It can only be done with public investment. Obviously, there's a private sector that could assist and be part of that, but it has to be led by a unified and coherent plan for how we're going to save a sustainable planet environment in which human beings can survive. And it's really now a sort of a toss-up whether that's going to be the case.
Yeah, well, it's been a toss-up for a while, and the rest of the world trusts us so little now because the next election, everything could be reversed, once again. So with that it's hard to know how to let people understand or help people understand fully enough the importance of having a leader. I don't care who it is, but it could be Republican or Democrat. You could have a Republican, you could have Arnold Schwarzenegger is not able to run for president, but he's a very strong Republican who's been out there speaking about climate change for quite a while and trying to encourage people. So it doesn't have to be a Democrat, but typically the progressives seem to have much more of the incentive is just the profit incentive to keeping fossil fuels is so massive. I don't know if you've seen this week, or I guess it's been a few weeks since COP28, the climate summit in Dubai is underway, and the president of that, who is also the head of the national enterprise for oil in Dubai, is saying, the science is. I can hardly even get the words out of my mouth, but the science is still not that strong that fossil fuels, are causing climate change. And now he's walking it back because there's so much of a uproar against him.
Yeah.
But and thank God there was, and he had to walk it back. But still, the people that own these companies are not ever going to be the ones to say, "Yeah, we got to pull it back and go to other alternatives."
Enough, by the way, because if they do take steps in that direction that impact the value of the stock and the bottom line, they pay a price in terms of their longevity in that position. The perspective of too many investors is what's going to be the short-term maximum that we can extract from this enterprise, and that means that if it's you might be making OxyContin, well, let's keep selling it, let's keep promoting it, despite the fact that it's a deadly product that was killing people, but it was profitable. And likewise, asbestos, Johns Manville, the same thing in years past. Philip Morris with cigarettes, Exxon with fossil fuels. They know what the damages that their products are causing. They know it, and they keep doing it anyway because it's profitable. And so I think we have to insist on a public agenda, a public resources used on behalf of public benefit. And I'm less concern about whether or not United Gigantic is going to be able to maximize its bottom line in the short term.
United Gigantic. I shouldn't be laughing because you laugh so you don't cry. But you've been involved in a lot of, I imagine, labor negotiations, and you've kind of been front row to some of these conversations. I'm wondering, do you have any insight, if there's insight to be had, about what would cause a person who has children, who has grandchildren, who no one hates the world, no one hates the planet. Like, how could the maximization of your own profits for your own family or your own self, how can that again and again, do you understand how that could block out your entire concern for humankind, for the planet, for your own children and grandchildren? I don't understand it. Never have.
Hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. And there's some people, wealthy folks, who recognize that
Sure.
they need to rethink their priorities. So I wouldn't argue that it's out of the question, but there has to be public standards established. And I think public investment in energy, in transportation, in finance, these things all make sense to me. I'm one of those populists whose progressive politics include an idea that we should have a mixed economy. I for example, find cooperatives a really interesting addition to that whole mix. Mm-hmm. And that's what the populists were about. They argued that the public policy should be supporting cooperative enterprise, meaning it's private initiative, but it takes a collective form, so that it would mean that farmers, dairy farmers, for example, would amalgamate their individual production from their different farms into a single bulk potential that could be sold on the market at a return that's greater for the farmers, because you're doing more of that work of bulking it and that economy of scale, and you do it on behalf of your collective interests as a community of farmers. One of my favorite spots in America is Westby, Wisconsin. And Westby, Wisconsin has Organic Valley is one of the major dairy co-ops collectively owned by farmers on behalf of their collective interests. They have the creamery owned by the immediate area farmers. The phone company is owned by a cooperative of the client. The customers own the phone company cooperatively on behalf of maximizing their interests in a context where the major phone companies wouldn't invest in a phone system or an electrical system because it wasn't profitable enough. So they also have their own electrical system, cooperatively owned. The energy, phone, creamery, the Organic Valley Co-op. This to me is a new way of thinking about things, where it would be mixed public enterprise, sometimes publicly owned, but sometimes cooperatively owned, sometimes private enterprise, where it makes sense. And I see that mixed economy as the way forward.
Yeah, it sounds like a social enterprise, sort of like that. There's a relatively new government structure, I guess, that you can use. I have a friend who did that in Boulder. Certain states allow for what they call a social enterprise, where there's a limit to how much profit you can give back to investors, and it's a mix. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but it's a structure of government that kind of allows for some of the tax benefits that come with kind of organization you're talking about.
There's something comparable here, where people are talking about community benefits, so that if there's going to be, for example, subsidies offered to encourage investment in affordable housing, or if there's going to be any kind of development project where there's public monies committed, there has to be a contract in effect that says, and in return, there'll be so many local jobs created, and they will be paid actually a living wage, and not just a meager minimum wage.
Right.
And outcomes that include affordable housing and so on. That kind of bargaining is, I think, very important and should be expanded on behalf of the public interest.
We're this town of Westby. How do you spell that? I can't even.
Westby.
Westby.
It's in western Wisconsin, near La Crosse.
Okay, so why is that area? How did they succeed in doing that? Because it's so great to have a small test case of something that you could expand at least into some areas. But what was their impetus?
Well, it was actually, we were talking about progressive Republicans.
Uh-huh.
And Wisconsin was where that movement, the La Follett's family in particular,
Mm-hmm.
Robert La Follette, who was the governor and then senator, and his sons, who followed him into both the governor's office and the Senate, they called themselves progressive Republicans. And what they were about was this idea of a mixed economy, that where it makes sense that there should be public standards and public investment, particularly in urgent matters. And these days, that would be climate change. But
Mm-hmm.
their argument was that's what farmers needed in Wisconsin, was support for cooperative enterprise, where farmers left to their individual fate in a massive economy like ours, they're going to get crushed. But if they cooperatively come together, they have some bargaining leverage and some ways
Sure.
of mobilizing resources on behalf of their collective interests as farmers, as a community. And so a lot of it is a legacy of that progressive republicanism of the 1920s, 1930s, and into the 1950s. For a time, they called themselves the Progressive Party. And they eventually, the problem is that the number of farmers was dramatically plummeting as more and more mechanization and as corporate agribusiness became more predominant as it is today.
Do you think there then could be a party of progressive Democrats and progressive Republicans, maybe even with, not for this next election cycle, but eventually, where you take some of these ideas that people can see they're common sense ideas, they don't get into all the extremism on actually either side, and work towards some things like climate change,
It's possible, but I don't think it would be. It's not. I mean, I'm guessing here, and I don't claim to be a political scientist, but I would see a possibility where down the road there could be established a multi-party system in which maybe progressive Republicans break away from a Trump-defined and dominated party, and they would be able in turn to bargain with progressive Democrats over an agenda that's common, might represent a step forward. You would have to talk about the practical politics of case by case, what particular issue you're trying to address, but that's a possibility. And these days,
gotta do something.
you got to do something. And what I would be about in terms of my, wish list is got to be tempered, and I got to step back from that because we do need to avoid what otherwise next year could look like, Germany in the 1930s, where an authoritarian wins election and then uses that on the basis of restricting the vote in so many states these days. I think if it was left to a real representation of where the people of this country are at, Trump wouldn't have a chance. But with his capacity for manipulating the media and with the restriction on voting rights and the discouragement of voting in many locations, it's a toss-up. We face a real crisis.
I wonder if Lynn Cheney is such a conservative person and hard to think of her as a progressive, but she is right now being a very strong voice to stand up to what the direction that the Republican Party is moving. So I guess my question might, well, go ahead if you wanted to comment.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious, like if you had a dream person to lead such a party, is there anyone that you could think of that? Because I can't at the moment think of anyone who would be a great candidate for that because people are so polarized. But when somebody is strong enough to go against everybody in their party because of doing the right thing, at least in that area, that gets my attention.
Yeah, I mean, it gets my attention, and I understand, why we're speculating on this because the circumstances are so grim right now. But my favorite Republican, hearkening back to something we were talking about earlier, is Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, but that's back in the 1950s, and that was a Republican Party that was capable of living within and working within a system that had, for example, substantial protection of labor rights.
Yeah, their platform was very liberal and compared to today. Not even the same thing.
He would not ever have a chance in the Republican Party of today.
No, but parties change as we see.
Right. Agreed.
And to have, I think what we're looking for is leadership that would say, And the hunger, there's such a hunger in this country on both sides to get past this point of what could be, as you say, no return. If we have a Trump election win, I think if if people don't come to their senses of what's actually going to happen in the next, if he wins, then certainly by the time if he did win, by the time his reign is over, I think there might be, if there's anything left, there might be a willingness to change and to look for something better.
It's possible. I mean,
I hope we don't have to go through that.
Right. The immediate priority is to make sure that we don't descend into that vortex by electing basically a budding fascist is what he amounts to.
Do you expect in this next election that people will use the term populism to confuse the voters?
They already are.
Intentionally?
Well, I mean, if you're calling Biden, Trump, and Bernie Sanders all populists, what does the term mean?
But does that have a purpose behind it? Because I think some people will use it with a purpose, to try to scare people one way or the other.
I believe that's the case. I think, as we were talking about earlier, the term has become anti-elitist, and the elites that feel threatened by that are going to propose that they're responsible elites, and they should not be challenged in this polarizing manner, and that we should therefore continue with the status quo, things as they are, and not rock the boat. And the problem is we do need to rock the boat. We do need to actually challenge a status quo that has gotten us to this point. But that means distinguish it between our argument on behalf of changing the world and those who want to change it in a way that's ugly and dehumanizing and nasty. And that's where the debate is going to be.
Yeah, it's going to be a heck of a year. Well, what advice would you give to voters who are trying to navigate this varied and contradictory values about populism? How would you advise people to be able to sort of separate the forest for the trees, the truth from the non-truth?
I would actually, I think any proposal has to be questioned on behalf of who is proposing it, what money is behind it, what interest does it serve. And I think we have to be careful that we look in the direction of how do we maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. And that means addressing climate change. I think, in a way, that's the most urgent issue facing us. It's an existential crisis.
Right.
I mean, if we address other matters but fail here, it doesn't matter.
Right.
The rest of it's going to be circling in that vortex. So I would argue that the key question is, what do we do about eliminating fossil fuels, and how do we develop public programs that maximize alternative technologies, by the way, including trains, to make them relevant to people in Denver and elsewhere.
I don't know how fast a fast speed train is like in Japan, but aren't they over 200 miles an hour? Aren't they well over that?
I don't know. I think so. But
I think they are.
I've been on one in France, and it was doing 180 miles an hour.
Yeah. All right.
190 miles an hour, and it's like downtown to downtown. So it was like you weren't messing around with that whole business. Now we go through in airports,
right?
And it made a huge difference. It's doable here. It's not a short-term matter. It requires long-term investment, but you got to get started.
Yeah. Well, I want to hold this book up one more time, Forgotten Populists. It's so interesting, and I think it really helps us get to when farmers turn left to save democracy. It's a very compelling, sort of a catch line there, but it's really true. And what's so interesting is how much, as you described, it has impacted politics ever since, and made significant changes for Black people, for women, for unions, for everyone who's not.
Right.
I don't want to. Anyway, so it's a wonderful book, and I think I heard you say somewhere that it's available Well, it's available in many places. What's the
Well, you go to your
best
local
place?
bookstore and special order it. They can get it from Ingram, which is the wholesaler. You can go to Amazon and order it there. There is the website is forgottenpopulist.com. And there's a button there you can order it from. We want to expand the options to include places like Powell's, which is a bookstore in Portland, actually a unionized bookstore. And they do have online sales. So we hope that people take advantage of those options as well. But it's on Amazon.
So you can order it from Powell's right now, or is it a special order situation?
You go to online to Powell's and you just
you can order it
in the title of the book, and and they will send it to you.
I will. I love that you brought that up, and I'll put links to all these different areas where people can purchase a book, as well as the website forgottenpopulist.com. But Powell's. I gave a book talk there once years ago when my first book came out, and if you haven't been there, it is a joy.
Oh, it's a wonderful bookstore. It's so many.
It's worth a trip to Portland.
Older buildings connected by these stairways, and it's like Franz Kafka.
It is an experience in itself, and just and a lovely one at that. So I'll definitely put that link on there. Well, Steve, thank you so much. This has really been fascinating, and it almost, in a weird way, gets me a little bit excited for the election. Maybe people can look at when they see the words, it will definitely jump out, and to take a little, not just slam dunk into what you think it's going to be, but like really stand back and say, what are they really trying to say by populism, and is it true, and what does it really mean? So educated some people along the way. So thank you including myself. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.